The room went silent. One board table that had seen mergers, hostile takeovers, and men brought to their knees. And Ada Daniels had just said, "Thanks, baby," to the most feared man in the room. She felt it before she heard it. The way her own voice seemed to echo back at her like a mistake she couldn't catch. Her hand was still extended, still holding the document she had just passed to him. Shin Jae-won hadn't moved. He was still looking at her with that same unreadable expression he always wore in public. But something behind his eyes shifted. Just barely. Just enough for her to see it. She straightened, cleared her throat, looked back at her presentation screen like the ground hadn't just swallowed her whole. But the room had heard it. Every single person in that room had heard it. And nothing. Not her credentials, not her composure, not the 3 years she had spent being twice as sharp and half as visible. Nothing was going to put that word back in her mouth. Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Stories. In today's episode, we bring you reignited love, faded reunions, quarrels, bonds, and dark romance. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe, turn on your notification bell so you don't miss out on new story drops. Let me know in the comments which city you're watching from. I want to see how far these amazing stories have traveled. Now hold on to your seats as we take a deep dive into this amazing story. Ada Daniels was not the kind of woman who made mistakes like this. She was 31 years old, Lagos-born, and had built her entire career on one thing: control. She was the head of brand strategy at the Lagos Satellite Office, a mid-tier branch that operated under the vast umbrella of Seoul Shin Industries. She had fought for that title. She had earned every syllable of it in rooms where people looked at her and immediately underestimated her. Rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. Rooms where she had to be flawless just to be considered competent. And then the quarterly conference happened. It was supposed to be routine. The Lagos branch had been summoned to Seoul for the Q2 review. Ada had prepared for weeks. Her deck was immaculate. Her numbers were airtight. She had rehearsed every possible question and had an answer ready before it could even be finished. She walked into that conference room in a blazer the color of midnight, her natural hair pinned back. She was not ready for Shin Jae-won. He walked in last. Not because he was disorganized. Because he owned every room he entered, and he wanted everyone in it to feel that ownership before he even sat down. He was tall, quiet in the way that felt dangerous. He wore a dark suit and an expression that gave nothing away, and when his eyes swept the room during introductions they paused, just for a fraction of a second, on Ada. She looked away first, but something about that fraction of a second stayed with her all through the meeting. She gave her presentation with her usual precision. She answered every question cleanly. She was, by every measurable standard, the most prepared person in that room. And when it was over, when the other department heads were gathering their folders and making small talk near the door, she heard a voice behind her. Low, measured, Korean-accented English that landed with unusual weight. "Miss Daniels." She turned. Shin Jae-won was still seated. He hadn't moved toward the door like everyone else. He was looking at her like he was genuinely interested. Not with hunger. Not with the casual entitlement she had learned to brace for from men in power. With something that felt uncomfortably close to curiosity. "Your third quarter projection," he said. "The variable you used for market penetration. Walk me through your reasoning." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't small talk. It was a test. Ada held his gaze, set her folder back down, and walked him through every single number. She didn't know it then. She couldn't have known it. But that was the moment everything started. He asked her to stay back after the meeting 3 days later. It was framed as a follow-up, a strategic debrief about the Lagos branch's numbers and how they could be repositioned within the broader Shin Industries framework. Professional, necessary, completely reasonable. Ada told herself all of this as she gathered her notes and waited while the last of the other executives filtered out of the conference room. She told herself this was work. Just work. Shin Jae-won closed the door. And then he didn't look at his notes once. He looked at her. He asked her questions that had nothing to do with numbers, what she thought about the direction of the company, where she believed the gaps were, what she would do differently if she were in charge. He listened carefully, not waiting for his turn to speak, not half distracted by his phone. Fully, completely present, like what she was saying mattered. Ada was careful. She gave measured answers. She kept her tone professional and her eye contact brief. But somewhere around the second hour, when the Seoul skyline had gone dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and the building had grown so quiet she could hear the hum of the air conditioning, she laughed at something he said. Shin Jae-won looked at her when she laughed like she had just shown him something rare. She straightened immediately, cleared her throat, reached for her water. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, and Ada Daniels did not miss it. She left that night telling herself it meant nothing. She was back in his conference room 2 days later. It became a pattern so gradually that Ada almost didn't notice it forming. Stay back after the meeting, Miss Daniels. I have a few questions about the Lagos projections. The other department heads would leave, and the door would close, and suddenly, it wasn't a debrief anymore. It was just the two of them and the city lights and conversations that kept stretching longer than they were supposed to. He would order food without asking her if she was hungry, always getting it right. He would refill her water glass without breaking the flow of conversation. Small things. Quiet things. Like he was paying very close attention. Ada noticed all of it and said nothing. But she started taking longer to leave. One evening, almost 3 weeks into her extended Seoul stay, the Lagos branch visit had been extended twice now, both times at Shin Jae-won's quiet directive. She was standing at the window while he took a call. The city below was all light and motion. She had her arms crossed, and she was thinking about nothing in particular when she felt him come to stand beside her. The call was done. He hadn't gone back to the table. He just stood beside her and looked out at the same city, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "Do you miss Lagos when you're here?" It was such a simple question. Such an unexpectedly human one coming from a man who spent most of his time being terrifying. Ada turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. Not at the city. At her. "Sometimes," she replied, "but less than I expected." He held her gaze for 7 full seconds before he looked away. That night Ada sat in her hotel room and had a very serious conversation with herself. She listed all the reasons this was impossible. He was her superior, several times over. She was a guest in his city, in his building, under his corporate authority. She knew almost nothing about his personal life except for the carefully guarded pieces Seoul's business world had decided to make public. She was a black woman from Lagos navigating a world that had its own unspoken architecture of belonging. She knew all of this. She still couldn't sleep. The first night he came to her hotel was not planned. It was past 11. She had just gotten off a late call with her Lagos team and was still in her work clothes, her heels abandoned near the door, her hair unpinned and falling loose around her shoulders. When the knock came, she assumed it was housekeeping. She opened the door, and Shin Jae-won was standing there in a dark jacket, no tie, looking like a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely sure about. He said, "I was in the area." The hotel was 40 minutes from his office. Ada looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. They talked until 3 in the morning, about everything and nothing, about his mother and the weight of a name that came with an empire attached to it, about Ada's early years in Lagos, the hunger that had shaped her, the way she had built herself piece by careful piece. They talked about loneliness, about past love interest. At some point the city outside went completely quiet. At some point the space between them on that small hotel, sofa non-existent. He left at 4. Just before he did, standing at the door, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and said her name, Ada. She leaned against the doorframe and looked back at him. "Good night, Jae-won," she whispered calmly. It was the first time she had used his name without his title. Neither of them mentioned it the next morning in the conference room, but something had shifted, something quiet and permanent and impossible to put back. There was a morning, maybe 6 weeks in, after everything had stopped being deniable, when she woke up before him in his Seoul apartment and just lay there. The city was still gray outside the wide windows. He was asleep beside her, his face completely unguarded, and Ada looked at him and felt something shift painfully in her chest. She thought about her flight, about Lagos, about the branch meeting she had at 9, and the professional distance she would have to reconstruct before she walked into that building. She thought about how none of that felt real right now. How this This quiet gray morning, this man sleeping beside her, this strange and impossible thing they had built in stolen hours, was the only thing that felt real. She didn't want to go to work. She wanted to stay exactly here. She wanted more mornings like this one. She wanted the version of J1 that existed before the suit went on and the boardroom face came back. The one who made her tea without being asked and read beside her in comfortable silence and laughed, actually laughed, at her dry Lagos humor. She wanted things she had no business wanting. When he woke, he found her looking at the ceiling. He turned to look at her without saying anything. Then he reached over without a word and laced his fingers through hers. They were 20 minutes late to the office that morning. It was the only time in Ada Daniels' entire career that she had been late to anything. She didn't regret a single second of it. But happiness, Ada was learning, had a way of making you careless. Not reckless. Not obvious. Just softer around the edges. Less armored than you needed to be. She noticed it in small ways. The way she smiled at her phone screen during board prep when his name appeared. The way she caught herself humming in the elevator of a building where she had previously been all business. The way she stopped dreading the quarterly conferences and started counting down to them instead. She hated that she was counting down. She hated how good it felt anyway. J1 was different in private in ways that still surprised her. The man who made entire boardrooms hold their breath would sit across from her at midnight with his glasses on. Glasses he never wore publicly, going through her strategy documents and arguing with her about market positioning like it was his favorite sport. He argued seriously. He listened seriously. He took her opinions and turned them over and pushed back when he disagreed and conceded cleanly when she was right. Ada had never felt more professionally respected by anyone in her life. She had also never been more in danger of losing her professional life entirely. Because Shin Jae-won was keeping them a secret. And she understood why. She did. The architecture of his world was complicated in ways that went far beyond corporate optics. His mother, Madame Shin, was still the true head of the Shin conglomerate. Not ceremonially, actually. She had stepped back from the daily operations, but nothing of consequence happened inside that empire without her quiet approval. Jae-won was the Mafia boss now, feared from Seoul to Lagos to every boardroom in between, but inside the walls of the Shin family home, he was still a son first. And he was terrified of what his mother would think of Ada. He never said it directly. That wasn't his way. But Ada was perceptive. She noticed the way he grew slightly distant whenever his mother called during their evenings together. She noticed the way he never spoke about the future in concrete terms, always hypothetically, always carefully. She noticed that in 3 months of something that had become undeniably real, she had never once been introduced to a single person in his personal life. She filed all of it away, said nothing, but it settled in her chest like a stone she was learning to carry. One night, it came close to the surface. They were in his apartment, late, the remains of dinner still on the coffee table. Ada had her feet tucked beneath her on his sofa, reading through a brief on her laptop. Jae-won was on a call. She could hear him in the next room, his voice low and controlled the way it got when he was managing something difficult. When he came back, he sat down heavily and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. She watched him. "Your mother?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. A pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Business," he said. Ada held his gaze. "Jae-won." He looked away first. This time it was him. She closed her laptop slowly. "You know I'm not asking you to announce anything. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But I need to know that what this is," she gestured between them, "is something you're not ashamed of." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. He turned back to look at her immediately. Something moved through his expression, sharp and certain. "Never. Don't ever think that." "Then what is it?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "My world is complicated, Ada. I know that. You don't know all of it. Then tell me." Another pause. Longer this time. "My mother," he started, then stopped. Chose different words. "She has expectations that were set long before you walked into that conference room. About what my life should look like. Who should be in it." Ada was still. Her face was unreadable, but her hands had tightened slightly around her laptop. "And you think I don't fit that picture," she blurted out. "I think she might not see you the way I see you," he said, choosing his words carefully. The room was very quiet. Ada nodded once. Slowly. Then she opened her laptop again. Jae-won watched her. He knew her well enough by now to understand what that meant. She wasn't dismissing the conversation. She was putting it somewhere safe, so she didn't fall apart in front of him. That was Ada Daniels. She absorbed things in private and processed them alone, and came back the next morning composed and unreadable. He reached over and closed her laptop gently. Then he took her hand. She let him, and he rubbed it gently. But that night, in the dark, long after he had fallen asleep, Ada lay beside him and stared at the ceiling and thought about every room she had ever had to fight her way into. Every table where she had earned her seat twice over. Every version of "you don't quite fit here" that had been handed to her in polite, professional language. She had always pushed through. She had always been enough. She needed to know if she was enough for this. She didn't have the answer yet. Neither did he. And that terrified her more than anything else. The morning of the board meeting arrived like any other Seoul morning. Gray sky. The soft sound of the city waking up. Light coming through floor-to-ceiling windows in pale, thin strips. Ada woke up in Jae-won's apartment. She lay still for a moment, listening to his breathing beside her, feeling the warmth of the morning and the weight of what the next few hours required. Today was the quarterly board presentation. Full attendance. Family heads. Senior executives from 3 different countries. The kind of room where every word was measured and every expression was read. She had a presentation to deliver. She had to walk into that room and be Ada Daniels, flawless, precise, untouchable, with absolutely no evidence of where she had spent the night visible anywhere on her face or in her body language or in the way her eyes moved when they landed on him. She could do this. She had to do this. Jae-won stirred beside her. He opened his eyes and looked at her with that unguarded early morning expression that she had come to love quietly and completely. He reached up and tucked a lock behind her ear. "You're already in your head," he said to her. "I'm fine, Ada." "I'm fine, Jae-won," she responded. He studied her face for a moment. Then he sat up and pressed his lips to her temple. Slow, deliberate, the kind of gesture that wasn't about desire, it was about steadiness. Like he was trying to pass some of his calm into her. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she got up and started getting ready. They arrived at the building separately, 12 minutes apart. Ada had rehearsed her presentation 3 more times in the car. She was ready. She was composed. She was Ada Daniels, and she did not make mistakes. She walked into that boardroom and took her seat and opened her folder and did not look at him once. She was going to be fine. "Hey, before we proceed any further, don't you just love? I'd agree that the secrecy is a little not my thing, but their love story just makes my heart skip. Do you think Shin should have been hiding her from the whole world, or just faced his fears and whatever comes, they face as a couple? Strong and united? Drop your comments below. I want to know what you think. If you were Ada, would you have been able to keep your relationship a secret for that long? Because Ada was trying her absolute best. Let us know where you're watching from, and whether you think she was going to make it out of that room with her secret intact. The comment section is waiting for you, and trust me, you want to stick around for what happens next. The presentation was going perfectly. Ada was 40 minutes in, and she had not looked at him once. Not directly. Not even in the peripheral, casual way that colleagues look at each other during meetings. She had kept her eyes on her slides, on her notes, on the faces of the executives seated around the table. She had answered 3 questions with the kind of clean precision that made people sit up slightly straighter in their chairs. She was performing flawlessly. That was the problem. Because when you are using every ounce of your mental energy to not feel something, to not show something, to hold an entire secret behind your eyes while simultaneously delivering a quarterly presentation to 43 of the most powerful people in the Shin Industries network, you get tired. Not visibly. Not in any way that anyone in that room could have pointed to. But underneath the composure, in the part of her that only she had access to, Ada Daniels was exhausted. And exhausted people make small mistakes. She was on her final slide. Revenue projections for Q3. The numbers she had lived inside for weeks. She moved through them with quiet authority, pulling the printed summary sheets from her folder and beginning to pass them down the table the way she had planned. Left side first. Then the right. When she reached the head of the table, she turned. Shin Jae-won was already looking at her. He had been careful all morning. She knew because she could feel it. The deliberate way he had maintained his boardroom face, the distance he had constructed between his public self and everything they were to each other in private. He was giving nothing away, but he was looking at her. And Ada, who was tired, who had woken up beside this man that morning, who had felt his lips on every inch of her body just last night, when no one else was watching, she handed him the document and said out loud, "Thanks, baby." The words left her mouth before her brain could catch them. For one suspended, horrible second, she didn't fully register what she had said. She was already turning back to her presentation screen, already opening her mouth for the next sentence, when the silence hit her. The entire room seemed to inhale at once, and then hold it. Ada stopped. Her hand was still slightly extended from passing the document. Her eyes were on the screen. And then, with the slow, terrible clarity of someone watching a glass fall in slow motion and being completely unable to stop it, she understood what had just come out of her mouth. She turned back to face the room. 43 faces. Some carefully neutral, some not careful enough. One woman near the back with her lips pressed together. Two of the family heads exchanging the briefest glance. An assistant near the door, who had stopped typing. Ada straightened. She looked at her presentation screen. She said in a voice, Q3 projections show a 14% increase across all Lagos branch verticals. I'll take questions at the end. And she kept going. She finished the presentation. Every remaining slide. Every number. Every projection. She answered 2 more questions at the end with complete composure. She thanked the room. She closed her folder. And she did not look at Shin Jae-won once for the rest of that meeting. The meeting ended. People began to move. Chairs scraped back. The low murmur of post-meeting conversations started filling the room. Ada gathered her materials with steady hands and did not rush. Rushing would have been visible. She moved at her normal pace, organized and unhurried, and she walked out of that boardroom with her head level. She made it to the hallway. She made it around the corner. She found a bathroom, went inside, locked the door, and stood at the sink with both hands gripping the cold porcelain for exactly 60 seconds. Then she looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was composed. Her eyes were dry. She looked exactly like herself. She turned the tap on, ran cold water over her wrists, and breathed. She had said it. She had actually said it. In front of 43 executives, 2 family heads, and God knows how many people who were already on their phones. She had called Shin Jae-won, the most feared man in 3 countries, the head of one of the most powerful conglomerates in Asia and Africa, baby, in a board meeting, during a quarterly presentation, while his mother's representatives were seated at that same table. She turned the tap off, straightened her blazer, walked back out into the hallway. The rumors moved faster than she did. By the time Ada reached the elevator, the whispers had already started. She could feel them, not hear them exactly, but feel them the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. The slight shift in how people looked at her as she passed. The conversations that paused a half-second too long. The colleague from the Tokyo branch who smiled at her with just a little too much knowledge in it. By the time she reached the lobby, her phone had 2 messages from colleagues she barely knew asking if she was all right. By the time she was in the car, the story had already taken its first shape. The boss is having an affair with his secretary from the Lagos branch. Not brand strategist. Not department head. Secretary. Because that was how these stories always got told, wasn't it? Because a black woman from a satellite office could not possibly be in that room for her numbers. Could not possibly have earned that table. The narrative had been written before anyone had even gotten the details right, and it had already decided what Ada Daniels was. She sat in the back of that car and looked out the window at Seoul moving past her and felt something cold and heavy settle in the center of her chest. She had worked for 10 years for her reputation. 10 years of being flawless and precise and unassailable. 10 years of giving no one any ammunition. And in one unguarded second, one small, exhausted, terrifyingly human second, she had handed them everything they needed. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. It was Jae-won. 2 words. Come up. She almost didn't go. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment, the car idling outside the building, and she thought about what going up meant. It meant walking back into that building where the whispers were still warm. It meant being seen going to his floor. It meant, depending on who was watching, depending on who was already building the story, confirming everything the room had already decided to believe. She thought about her Lagos office, her team, the 10 years she had spent building something that could now be reduced to a single word. Then she thought about the look on his face when he touched her temple that morning. She got out of the car. His office was empty except for him. He was standing at the window when she came in, his jacket off, his back to the door. He turned when he heard her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Ada closed the door behind her. She stood straight. Her face was composed. Everything about her posture said, "I am fine." Jaewon turned to look at her. He crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled her into him without a word. Ada stood completely still for exactly 2 seconds. Then something in her chest unlocked, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed him in and held on. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember that underneath all of it she was a person and not a performance. He held her like she was something he was not willing to let the world take from him. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his shoulder. Quiet. Controlled. "That was unprofessional, and Ada." His voice was low. "Stop." She was quiet. "Look at me." She pulled back and looked up at him. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it outside of his apartment. No boardroom face. No careful distance. Just him, looking at her like the only thing that mattered right now was her. "I'm not letting them tell this story," he whispered. Ada searched his face. "What does that mean?" she asked. He held her gaze. "It means I'm done hiding. It means I'm calling my mother tonight." The room went very quiet. Ada felt her heart do something complicated and frightening. "Jaewon, I should have done it months ago, and I didn't, because I was afraid of something that." He stopped. Exhaled. "I need to make that call, Ada, and I need you to trust me." She looked at him for a long moment, then finally said, "Okay," barely above a whisper. He cupped her face in both hands. "Okay," he repeated. He called his mother that evening. Ada was not in the room when he did it. She had gone back to her hotel, showered, changed, and sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet with her hands folded in her lap. She had turned her phone face down. She couldn't look at the notifications anymore, the messages from colleagues, the carefully worded emails, the ones that pretended to check on her while actually fishing for confirmation. She had read enough of them to know the story was already fully formed and spreading. She sat with the silence instead. She thought about Lagos, about her mother's voice on the phone last Sunday, asking when she was coming home, saying she sounded different lately. "Different how, Mama?" Her mother had paused and said, "Lighter." Ada had laughed it off. Now she sat with that word in the quiet of her Seoul hotel room and understood exactly what her mother had heard. She had been lighter. She had been, without fully allowing herself to name it, happy. And now she was sitting here waiting to find out if that happiness had an expiry date that someone else got to decide. Her phone screen lit up face down on the bed. She turned it over.
"Jaewon."
She answered before the second ring. "How did it go?" she asked. Her voice was steady. A pause on his end, long enough to make her chest tighten. Then he replied, "She wants to meet you." Ada blinked. She stopped. "That's it? She wants to meet me? That's it. Jaewon." Ada pressed her fingers to her forehead. What exactly did she say? He was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was the part Ada would replay in her mind for a very long time afterward, she said it was about time. She said she had been waiting for me to bring someone home for 3 years, and that she didn't care where you were from as long as you were serious and as long as...
He stopped.
As long as what? Ada asked. A pause. As long as you were open to giving her grandchildren, he said. Those were her exact words. The silence that followed was enormous. And then Ada Daniels, private, guarded, composed Ada Daniels, who had not cried once through any of this, started laughing. Not a polite laugh. Not the brief, surprised laugh that escaped her in his conference room all those months ago. A real one. Deep and unraveling and completely helpless. She laughed until she had to press her hand over her mouth. Until her eyes were wet. Until she was lying back on the hotel bed, looking at the ceiling with her chest shaking. Grandchildren, she managed finally. He was terrified to tell his mother about me, and she just wanted grandchildren. Ada. 3 years, J1. She was still laughing, but underneath it something else was moving. Something warmer and more painful. You carried that for 3 years. He was quiet. I know, he said. Simply. No excuse. Just acknowledgement. Ada stared at the ceiling. The laughter had settled now into something softer. She really didn't care, Ada said. Quietly now. Almost to herself. She really didn't care, he confirmed. The twist nobody saw coming was not the slip. It was not the boardroom silence or the rumors or even Madame Shin's reaction. The twist was what Madame Shin said next, what Jae-won told Ada the following morning when he came to her hotel before either of them had gone to the office. He sat across from her at the small table by the window, both of them with coffee going cold between them, and he told her that his mother had known. Not suspected.
Known.
Madame Shin had known about Ada Daniels for 2 months. A woman who had built an empire did not survive by missing things. She had seen the extended Lagos branch visits. She had noticed the conference schedules rearranged with a particular strategic convenience. She had, at one point, quietly requested Ada's full professional profile, not to investigate her, but because she wanted to know who her son was looking at like that. She had read every page of it, and she had decided, privately and completely, that Ada Daniels was exactly the kind of woman she had hoped her son would find. She had been waiting for her son to do the honors of bringing her home. Ada sat with this information for a long moment. She was waiting for you, Ada said. Yes. All this time. While I was worried for nothing. Ada looked at him across the table. This man who could silence boardrooms and move empires and make men twice his size step back without raising his voice. This man who had been so afraid of his mother's disapproval that he had hidden something real and precious for months. This man who was sitting across from her now, looking like someone who had just set down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers properly. So what happens now? She asked. He looked at her and replied, Now, you come to dinner and meet my mother, and we stop pretending this is something we have to hide. Ada looked at their joined hands on the table. She thought about the conference room where it started, the late nights, the early mornings, the gray soul light coming through wide windows while he slept, and she lay beside him, wanting things she had convinced herself were too much to want. She thought about the boardroom and the silence and the 2 words that had undone 3 months of careful composure in less than a second. Thanks, baby. She had been mortified. But sitting here now, with his hand warm in hers and the city outside just beginning its morning, she thought, quietly, privately, in the part of herself that she protected most carefully. Maybe it was the best mistake she had ever made.
Some things cannot be planned.
Some loves refuse to stay hidden no matter how disciplined the person carrying them. Ada Daniels had spent her whole life being the most controlled person in every room. But control, it turns out, has its limits. And sometimes the most human thing you can do is slip and let what's real finally breathe. Shin Jae-won almost let fear cost him the most important thing that had ever walked into his conference room. He almost let an assumption, one he never even verified, stand between him and the woman his mother had already approved of before he found the courage to ask. And Madame Shin? She just wanted grandchildren. So here is what we want to know. Drop your answers in the comments right now. If you were Ada, would you have walked back into that building after the slip, or would you have booked the first flight back to Lagos? And do you think Jae-won waited too long to tell his mother, or was he just being careful with something he didn't want to lose? And finally, was the slip really a mistake, or was some part of Ada ready to stop hiding? Tell us everything. We read every single comment. If this story moved you, wrecked you, or made you smile in places you didn't expect, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs a good love story today, and subscribe so you never miss a new episode. We drop new stories every week, and trust us, they only get better from here. This has been Afro-Korean Love Stories. We will see you in the next one.